I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook. We're at the 2019 UIC Medical Cannabis Symposium in Tweed Heads. We're here speaking with Cherie, who's known as Disco Sista. Cherie, tell us a little bit about your history and let's talk about cannabis.
Right. Well, we'll try and be brief. Basically, my history is that I am a registered nurse with a master's qualification in research. I've been nursing since 1990, approximately 30 years, specialising in intensive care, emergency. I've done paediatrics and adults, and more recently in addiction medicines as well, and anaesthetics. It's a broad spectrum.
And you work in an area...
Before I finished, I said I'm just trying to briefly do this.
Yeah.
I'm also doing civilian work and working in a cannabis advisory capacity and the grey market cannabis dispensaries, which I guess are not legal in Australia.
Which is a bone of contention.
It's a real problem we have in Australia, yes.
So what's your idea? What do you think we should be doing?
Okay. So for the last number of decades, the legal system has always been repulsed by recreational drug use. And people with dreadlocks or people that don't fit the neat and tidy civilian looks are basically criminalized because they are drug users. And we're talking about cannabis here.
I was just about to say I'm a drug user. It's called alcohol.
The first people that used cannabis got, 50-year sentences. It's crazy. And based on that model, please interrupt me whenever you like, but based upon that model of criminalization, and we know there's a lot of lies and politics, but basically we're not allowing the legalization of cannabis. And all the research that has been funded over the decades, and there's a lot of research, they fund NIDA based upon the premise that you need to show cannabis harm or a drug harm. So there is a lack of research historically showing that cannabis is simply a harmless drug. And I'm not going to use the word drug, plant.
Yeah. So indeed I was speaking with Jeffrey Hergenrath. He was saying that when they looked at, or when they teased apart the issue of harm, that it was actually alcohol, not cannabis, that was causing the harm. And then they repeated a study, and indeed that was what was shown.
Yes.
So, given that nothing is totally harmless, you've worked in a medical capacity, helping, caring for patients. What do you think is the patients most at risk? You would be most concerned about giving cannabis or a cannabis type product?
Right. So who's most at risk? And in terms of harm, well, let's just very briefly sum up the harm factor. There's an LD50 ratio here. That's what it's talked about.
Yep.
And salt is far more lethal, as is water, than cannabis. So for you to actually physically die from cannabis, it's not possible.
Right.
For you to be perhaps mentally disturbed by cannabis, maybe slightly possible. But can I talk about schizophrenia, for an example, and
absolutely.
show some research bias here?
Absolutely.
All right. So the traditional medical model is that cannabis increases schizophrenia and mental ill health. That model was funded by NIDA and they got money for the medical industry. But the realities are that in Australia and worldwide, cannabis use has increased fourfold, if not more. Yet the rates of schizophrenia have remained constant for the last 20 or 30 years. So that's what the Cochrane reviews are now showing, and the more emerging positive cannabis news. So there is no harm mentally. In terms of a pain medicine, unlike perhaps opioids, which are going to cause constipation and respiratory depression and death, and I have a lot of experience in the addiction side of medicines, cannabis has been funded as research to show that it is a gateway drug causing harm. Again, new research is now showing that in fact it's an exit drug. So if you take cannabis, you can actually reduce your dependency on opioids, whether you're an addict or a recreational user, but there's no such thing as a recreational user. You can reduce, cannabis will free you.
Yeah, I think the the research that points to it as a gateway drug need to include things like alcohol, sugar, sloth, watching video games. People who have a problem will use any sort of excuse to get away from that problem.
Right.
And that may be one of them, but it's not the cause of
Exactly.
an entry into a harder drug society, if you like.
Right. And New Zealand had a classic longitudinal study, which was nationally funded. And again, they wanted to show the harms, and they did. They showed that if you take cannabis over a 10-year period, so they looked at a town in New Zealand, demographically, they were able to demonstrate that people that take cannabis will have a lower IQ, particularly in the teenage age groups.
Yeah.
Subsequently, this research was used for education and safety programs in New Zealand. Well done. But subsequently, that research has been shown, like the doctors you just mentioned, to be full of bias. The bias in this case being is that the towns they studied came from broken families, unemployed, no jobs, higher alcohol and tobacco use. Yes, these kids are not finishing their schools either. So these factors contribute to low IQ, not cannabis. But that's not what the world wants to hear. We want to focus on our commercial products. I'm sorry, I have to say that word. It's all about money.
Yeah.
And so you've got to be very careful as to who is publishing good research or refusing to publish good research. That's called publication bias. And who is undertaking research, i.e. the lobbyists, in order to promote medical products. Now,
can I correct you on one word you said? You
Yes.
said that's what the world wants. I don't think the world wants drugs. I think the world actually wants the use, the acceptance, and the access to cannabis.
right. Different departments want their own interests served.
Government, yeah.
Yes. And the number one department is actually not the government, it's the lobbyists.
Right.
So the lobbyists are the primary funders for the medical schools in Australia, as in the pharmaceutical industry. They're the ones funding the universities of Australia, etc., lobbying the government for a very large opioid industry. So we learn about the opioid receptors and we learn all about tramadol and endone and everything else. But we're in the infancy of learning about the cannabinoid system because no one's really been able to market the plants.
Well, you can't, because it's been shown now that we keep concentrating on THC, which was the drug,
Yes.
and then the CBD, which was like, oh, that's okay, but you still have this drug issue. What about the terpenes? So
Yes.
then you've got a whole issue of how do you control for that? Do we just need to set this plant free?
Right. Well, I'm at the conference here, which is, what's this conference called again? Sorry?
UIC.
United in Compassion, UIC conference. And I've attended them for a couple of years, and it's wonderful to be here because there's a lot of knowledge. And what that knowledge is showing is that there are two departments. One is the medical department, the science, the medicines, and these people are looking at a cannabis plant which has, let's say, 200 cannabinoids, terpenes, volatiles, flavonoids, and they're narrowing them down, this is the Israeli research, down to maybe 3 or 6 cannabinoids which will specifically be effective for a specific disease, i.e. Tourette's or leukemia or a glioma, right? Not one plant treats them all effectively.
Yeah.
So that's where research is going. Ambulance frontline medicines are wanting to give CBD or CBDA or whatever terpene. But and so we have this emerging medical market, which is the legal system, so to speak. But there is a medical market already in Australia, and that is the one that's currently serving 300,000 Australians. It's the illicit market. It's power to the people. Now, if you just take the plant and eat it, you're going to have a health benefit. And you're not going to have a health injury. Really, you're not. Statistically. So if you're growing your plant and you're mixing your mint, your celery, your turmeric, and your pepper for your arthritis, well, add a bit of juiced cannabis leaves, because that's full of THCA and other terpenes and anti-inflammatories, and you're going to guaranteed to have less arthritic pain. You're going to have less depression and stress. Louis Armstrong was a great advocate for depression and cannabis.
I've got to say that the juice is actually very attractive to me. I will say one sort of issue I have with recreational. I know you don't like that word, but if cannabis was used freely by the public, and I came across this a couple of years ago where somebody lit up and they were having a joint, and I'd say, well, that's fine for you, great, wonderful, but I don't want to take your drug. I don't. If I'm taking methotrexate, I don't give you my methotrexate and tell you to take it. I don't.
In terms of smoke.
I don't make you have my tequila. I want it for myself. You know. But so there is that thing about, well, I don't necessarily want to imbibe your thing that's helpful for you. However, when you're talking about a different way of taking it, this juicing and things like that, that's really attractive on a number of levels because you're using it as a food. You know, I have big issues with the economy of this plant that could actually be helping Australian farmers. If we're actually using this as a health food,
yes,
that's a different way of looking at it.
Well, there certainly is the food market, and that's been driven primarily by the hemp industry, right? Still a cannabis plant.
Yeah.
So again, we have learnt over the years that perhaps smoking isn't as healthy. So now we're nebulizing in the form of vaporizing. That's very clean and pure vapors.
Right.
We can juice it as well. You can put it in your cooking, in your baking. And also very popular is the hemp creams, which have THC in it, which have CBD in it. And all these routes of absorption to the human body have a beneficial effect.
I think I need to re-examine my thoughts about how to use this plant. There's so much more coming out about it.
It's huge.
Yeah.
And really now, when I look at what's happening globally, I'm South African. I left South Africa, and unfortunately, after I left, now they have legalized the plant. So you can actually, well, they've had a moratorium for a couple of years. So you can, all my parents and family and my grandmothers, they're growing it in their back garden. And they're juicing it, and they're throwing it in their cooking. And my dad's taking it for his arthritis and things like that.
Yep.
New Zealand, they're great as well.
Yeah.
They're now having this big referendum where they're going to allow the people to take it socially. Let's not say recreationally.
Yeah.
Because really, I haven't met anyone who takes it just for fun.
Yeah.
Most people take it because they want to enjoy the pleasures of it. Whether it makes you feel happy, whether it just relieves you from stress, like a beer perhaps, or an orange juice or a spirulina, take it for its health benefits. And if you want to medicinalize it, great. Let's use it in surgery. I'm all for it. Let's use it in brain surgery and in anesthesia. Let's use it in addiction medicines like they're using it in Canada. Encourage people to not be injecting opioids, but to be taking cannabis. And let also my mother use it in her garden for her arthritis, because it's a plant. And really, there is the LD50 of cannabis as a plant is so low that it's unbelievable.
I think there's a whole new way of looking at it. I'm going to re-examine this for myself. Thanks so much for joining us on FX Medicine today, Sheree. That's really, really good.
Thank you.
This is FX Medicine. I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook.